Hello, everyone, and welcome to UCBUGG's presentation for Cal Day, or I guess Cal Week, Spring 2020. This is obviously a little different than how we normally do things, and we're all gonna be adjusting a little bit. So be patient with us. We're gonna try our best to handle any technical problems that happen. But I want to thank Myra, who is with us, and also everyone in the department who really helped put this together and for inviting us every year. It's always great. So today's presentation is going to be about the art of making an animated film. And we're going to just kind of give you a brief overview of some of the things that we talk about in our class, but also just kind of in general what goes into making an animated film. First, though, a little bit about us. So this presentation is hosted by UCBUGG, and that stands for the UC Berkeley Undergraduate Graphics Group. So no, it is not an insects group. They exist on campus, so if you're interested in them, you should check them out. But UCBUGG is what we call a DECAL, or Democratic Education at Cal. And basically, that just means that we are a course that is run and taught by undergrad students. So all of the facilitators, all of us giving the presentation today, we are all undergrad students that have taken this class in the past and have returned as facilitators. So it really is a community of students helping fellow students. And it's just kind of a great way to learn some topics that are more specialized or maybe intersectional that departments may not have. Decals are a great thing for that. Our class is about 19 years old, coming up on 20 years. So we've been around campus for a while. And we were started by Dan Garcia, whom I hope you guys get to meet if you come to Cal. I really hope you interact with him. He's the best staff faculty ever. He's just amazing. And we are offered every fall and spring semester. So if UCBUGG is something you're interested in, hopefully we are flexible in your schedule. And our course teaches students the entire animation pipeline from beginning to end. And the great thing about our class is that we don't expect that you have any prior experience or any prior background in animation. So you can be completely new to this and take our class. And you don't have to be a specific major to take our class. So it really is open to anyone who's interested. And also, I guess now is a good time to mention, if you have any questions during this presentation, please feel free to message them in the chat. We will stop for questions briefly, but if you have something about something we talk about, please feel free to say it in the chat and we'll try to get to that as soon as possible. So what goes into making an animated film? You guys, I'm sure all of you have either seen an animated film. I hope you have. If not, I'm sure you've at least heard of them. And behind your favorite animated movies, no matter what type or what medium that they are, whether they're 2D, 3D, stop motion, whatever, what goes behind an animated film is basically a lot of work from a lot of different people. Collaboration really is a key to animation, and in our class, we really emphasize group work, collaboration. And in UCBUGG, we like to call animation controlled chaos, because that's really what it is. It's kind of a lot of parts that are somehow separate, but then somehow not. They all come together, and each one of them is super important. If any one of the steps doesn't get done properly, you really can't have that final image. Going more specifically, those steps that you take in animation is usually called the animation pipeline, which may vary depending on what form of animation you're doing, but more or less, especially in 3D, this is the animation pipeline. And this is essentially what you would learn in our class if you take it. But even beyond our class, this is kind of the same process that happens no matter who you are, whether you are a student in UCBUGG or if you are a professional at Pixar, this is the same process. So it's a great thing about our class is that you're really learning applicable skills. So today we're just going to go through each of these steps and kind of briefly talk about them. And we're going to start at the beginning with pre-production.
All right, thank you for the intro, Ashna. My name is Wyatt. I am a facilitator at UCBUGG, and we're going to start by going over what pre-production is. So you got a good glimpse at that diagram of the pipeline of how animation actually is made. So before any of that really happens, to make your story sort of come to life in this animated form, you need to figure out how that story is going to be structured, how you're going to actually put together the different shots to make a cohesive story, what the characters are going to look like. And all this happens at a very high level in the very beginning. If you look in sort of the middle of those three images on the right, you can see what we call a storyboard. The storyboard is essentially a process of lining up the different shots from different major poses or actions of the main characters to determine like the flow of action in your animated short, basically. Below that, you can see what we would call a character sheet for Winnie the Pooh. A character sheet is basically just used to put together all of the basic ideas of what the character is going to look like, the scaling, the positioning, and you can see a lot of different poses there. That's to sort of give later on in the pipeline modelers and animators a reference to figure out sort of what the range of motion for the character is, what the physical limitations and freedoms will be for their movement, and what they'll kind of look like in different poses. And once you have sort of your character sketched out, as well as this storyboard put together, you get something that we call an animatic, which is, if you look at the very top image, that's a nice animatic from Steven Universe, a very fun show on Cartoon Network. And an animatic is basically just a very roughly animated version of your storyboard. And what it allows you to do is get a sense of sort of the timing and the pace between poses of the character, between actions of the character. And this is very important to figuring out how your actual animation will be paced later on. So you can see everything at this stage is obviously 2D, it's sketched out. It's a very rough draft version of your animation. And this is to be expected. This is sort of the first leg in the trip. So you'll be figuring out, very high level basic things and putting them down in forms like this. But as you get towards the end of the pipeline and all these different steps sort of start coming together and tying back in on each other, everything you'll end up with in your short will be intentional. And nothing will be really left up to chance. So we'll walk through that process and show you kind of how the different legs of the pipeline get you there.
All right, so after pre-production, after you have kind of your concepts and your ideas laid down, you want to get into the first step of actually working in 3D, and that is usually modeling. So modeling is just the process of actually creating the physical or tangible 3D assets, environments, characters, any 3D object that appears in your short would be created in this step of modeling. And the point of modeling is to basically take the concepts, all the ideas that you had, and turn them into a tangible model. And at Disney Animation, they have a quote or a kind of motto, I guess, which is creating believable worlds and relatable characters. And that really starts to become apparent in the 3D sense in this stage, creating those believable worlds, environments, assets. All of that needs to happen here. And as you can see in the images, in the examples, on the left you have the concept art, the character design, or the concept maybe for like an asset. And on the right you see the actual 3D model and how it's really important for the modeler to really carry the characteristics or the kind of like personality if it's a character, but just all the different details that are inherent in a concept. It's the modeler's job to really make sure that carries over into 3D.
Okay, so going a little bit further into the specifics of modeling, there are generally two ways we approach modeling, and one of them is called organic modeling. And this is mostly for things found in nature that we are going to be putting in our short. This is often all of our characters, whether they be animals or humans. any rocks, plants, so all these natural elements to our shorts. And this is often done with digital sculpting programs that really helps us achieve the more natural shapes. And then on the other side of things, we have hard surface modeling. So this is any household props, buildings, any manufactured things we would find in our world. And these are made a little bit differently. We we manipulate the geometry from there, and that helps us get our objects in our scene. So as you can see in these images, we have a character sculpt here, and as you can tell, there's nothing super like rigid about this at all. It is many organic shapes put together. Whereas on the other end of things, we have this kitchen scene that has been modeled, and you can see there's a lot of harsh edges in here. You can see how one may start with a basic piece of geometry and manipulate things from there to get these objects.
All right, hi, I'm Alex. I'm another one of the facilitators, and the next step of the pipeline, which I'll be covering, is shading. Shading is the step where we go and take all of these 3D models that we've created, which initially have a very flat, dull appearance, I guess, as you can see in the top right image, and we define how these materials should look, how these models should interact with light, whether they should look wooden, metallic, soft, shiny, waxy, painterly, glassy. Pretty much every single thing that we model, we have to shade in order to say how it should actually look once we want it to get rendered out into a final frame. There's other steps that are related to shading, which is like creating textures. This allows us to attach more fine detail, such as variation in the color. For example, on the barrel, we can see that they've added like a wood texture there, and then extra details too, where certain areas can look like they have a lot more detail than the 3D model initially had. So shading is used to create a really big variety of looks. It intersects a lot with art and stuff like that, from pre-production, where you're trying to make sure that you can mimic the look of the pre-production art and the final look of the film as closely as possible. So even though these are all 3D models, the way that they're shaded gives them completely different end results. And that's something that's like really powerful about shading, and it's an interesting intersection between this computer-y stuff and the art side of things. And so the next step is rigging, and basically we've gone over how to create models, but once you have these models, you actually need to make it so that you can use the models and create animation. And it's obviously way too time consuming to create a new model or to adjust a model manually every single time you want it to move. So instead, what we do is we set up a rig. And what that means is that we create a skeleton for the character. You can see the skeleton in the bottom right example there, where it's what we call a bunch of joints going through the character. And then what we do is we attach controllers, and this lets us essentially control the character as if it's kind of a puppet, and it makes things a lot easier to animate on rather than having to like manually modify the geometry of an object.
All right, so once you have your rig in place, or your skeleton, basically, now you can actually get into the step of animation, which is the part where you actually create the illusion of movement, and thereby you create an illusion of life. The whole point of animation, or the job of an animator, is to really create believable characters through various techniques. A lot of it has to do with the physical movement, or like the physics of a character, but also, believable characters also factor in the emotion, the weight and volume of a character, and the personality of a character, right? So, for example, in the top two GIFs, like the Beast and Miles from Spider-Verse, obviously two very different characters. The Beast is very large, very top-heavy, whereas Miles is very light, very agile. So obviously the way that the beast moves is probably going to be different than how Miles will move. And if you factor in further like their emotions, like right now, the beast looks extremely angry. He does not look happy at all. Versus Miles, who's extremely happy, carefree. So the way that their body responds to that is extremely different. And obviously on the beast, you can see a lot of like emotion also like on his facial expressions. And personality too. I would say that these two characters are very different in personality, and it's pretty apparent in the way that they move, in the way that they gesture. And all of that is really important in animation. And one kind of like final thing to think about as an animator is it's your job to basically take single frames or single like storyboard images and turn them into fully detailed sequences, fully fleshed out animation scenes, right? And while a storyboard is very clear in telling the main point of a scene, it doesn't really capture all the intricacies of a sequence. And so it's really the animator's job to embed that scene with personality, with artistic and creative decisions. And a lot of times this is where great animation comes out. And for me personally, I really like this example from Frozen 2. In this sequence where she's walking down the hallway, if you look at the original storyboard, the idea is the same. Like it's still Elsa walking down a hallway, but she looks kind of scared and reluctant, and she doesn't do anything with her hand. She just kind of like stands there. And you know, clearly in the final product, the animator clearly decided to add some confidence, some defiance, maybe some sass in there. And all of these decisions are things that the animator was like, you know, this is her personality, this is what she's feeling right now. So that hair flip is definitely something that was just added. And I think that's a really great example of artistic animation or like acting choices in animation. And to kind of break it down in a more approachable sense, if you learn animation in our class or just any class in general, you will always start with what's called the 12 principles of animation. And these are a little technical, so we won't go into them here, but essentially these are just the bare bones or the very basic rules that you follow as an animator. And they really help bring out the physicality and the believability of a character. So if you ever want to learn animation, definitely start with the 12 principles.
All right, so I'm Connie and I'm going to talk about lighting, and it's kind of what I would say almost an underappreciated part of the animation pipeline, and it's essentially the process of adding lights to a scene. And this can mean either adding real life lighting conditions, for example, sunny or overcast have different lighting conditions that might affect the mood of the scene, or it could be actually used to add more artistic flair to the scene itself and help show off all those shaders and those models that you've made previously leading up to this point. So the reason why lighting is pretty important is because it actually helps, you know, forward the story that you've presented back in pre-production. So it can help, for example, in this pictures on the right side, it can help you direct the viewer's eyes. So for example, where is the main character in this scene? What do you want to pay attention to? And also adds like a little bit of visual shaping, as in it kind of helps adds three-dimensionality to these characters by kind of illuminating, you know, where the main point of their face is with the key light, or it could be adding a little bit of a silhouette to them. And it can also add emotion to a scene through adding warm or cold colors, such as the more orange lights in the up picture in the middle, or more magenta and darker colors like in the picture from Ratatouille at the bottom. It can also add cohesiveness by bringing together all those visual elements and adding that, you know, that style that we mentioned back during pre-production by adding adding the right colors and the emotional purpose that you want when you're designing the actual storyboards and the characters. And it also just adds a final finishing touch to all of the work that you've previously done.
All right, hello, it is me again. So effects and simulation is a really key tool that animators keep in their back pocket because it allows you to pull off some very powerful or pull off some pretty powerful stunts when you're doing animation, pretty much. If you look at some of the examples we have here, using an effect or a simulation within a program like Maya is basically using a tool of the program to create this asset like fire or hair or a water simulation for you. A lot of these follow sort of like a procedural generation model or you know, different geometry randomization, but basically in general they follow a very similar model to real life physics and math, which is how you're able to achieve this very like realistic, compelling look. And one of the reasons that simulation in general is so important is because if you look at something like all the different strands of hair in that simulation of hair, or all the little details of like the foam or like the wave patterns in the ocean sim on the bottom, it's almost impossible to model or animate by hand that exact behavior. And so a lot of times it's much easier to let a computer generated simulation of that take care of the actual effect for you. And normally these sort of effects are very like graphically intensive. When we get into rendering and start talking about what rendering does, rendering effects can take hours and hours and hours. So it's a tool that is very powerful but should be used sparingly in the process. So we'll touch back on VFX sort of towards the end of the pipeline, but we'll move on to the next step after this.
Hi, my name's Ethan, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about rendering. So basically at this point in the pipeline, the artists have done all they can with the 3D scene. They've arranged all the geometry, the textures, lights, and cameras. And this is when we let the computer do its job by path tracing rays of light starting from a camera or viewpoint and basically simulating how that light bounces off materials or even refracts through other materials like glass, and you can simulate a variety of effects that happen with different material types. So as you can see here on the left side, there are two different kind of subcategories of light that we kind of divide rendering into. The first is called direct illumination. So it's basically the light that's coming straight from the light source and then one bounce off of the objects in the scene. So that's always going to be added to your final render. And then the second one here is called indirect illumination. So this is what really gives you that realistic effect of like reflections off of these colored walls on the balls, details in their shadows, etc. And that's done through that recursive process of generating rays and terminating them. The next point here is that on the right side, you can see that we need to increase our rate of sampling in order to get a picture that looks less fuzzy. This fuzz is something that we call noise. And this is kind of the reason why rendering takes a lot of power and time, is to find ways to reduce this noise without having to increase the sampling to a ridiculous rate. And that goes along with the idea of acceleration. We can use different data structures to achieve that. And the artists can also put separate render layers into their short so that we can divide up what geometry is being rendered at different times. And that sort of brings us into the next step, which is compositing.
Yes, so compositing is basically one of the very last legs of the pipeline. It's taking all the work that you've done previously with your animation, rendering it into different layers, and then putting it back together in a program like in UCBUGG. We typically use something like Adobe After Effects, which has pretty good layer management. It's essentially a process of layering different assets on top of each other to get the illusion of this holistic image, like you can see at the bottom, a very beautiful nature scene from the Gruffalo. But in reality, what's happening, if you look at the top images, it's actually a bunch of discrete layers that are being placed on top of each other with different information. And as they get combined and rendered out, or combined and exported out, they give this image, or the illusion of this cohesive image. Like we mentioned before, this is super useful for rendering different bits of geometry from your scene, because in general, you can render something like the background only once. If you have something like a stationary shot where, you know, the camera in your scene isn't going to be moving a lot. And then all the action, all the animation that your character is doing can be rendered separately. That way you save some time. And you can composite those layers together to get the illusion that the character is doing what he's doing in front of the background. It's also super helpful if you want to sort of cheat VFX a little bit. I mentioned something like using a fire effect. Doing an actual simulation of a fire effect can be very render intensive and take a lot of time and computational power. So sometimes it's easier to composite in a fire effect later on. And that has its own set of challenges. Namely, you have to sort of adapt that foreign asset into the same lighting and the same shadowing and basically make it look natural to the scene that you're just sort of dropping it into. But that's more of an artistic process, and generally you can save a lot of render time by doing something like that. So compositing is a very important step in putting everything together when you finally reach the end of the pipeline.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. So at this point, we've kind of gone briefly over every step in the pipeline, and we might have time to take maybe 1 or 2 questions. So if there are any, feel free to write them in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself at this point. If there are no questions right now, we can move on to the demo portion and then come back to questions. So I'll just go ahead and move over for now, but if you have a question, please feel free to write it down. Actually, all right, so for the last maybe 10 or 15 minutes, we're gonna kind of do a quick demo, just giving you an example of all the stuff we talked about, but in context of a short film. So this is a short film titled Brilliance that was from 2 years ago now, that was made by the UCBUGG facilitators. So we're gonna start, as we do, in pre-production.
Sorry, I was muted there for a second. So yeah, so pre-production here, we can see a lot of the same elements that we saw in sort of our basic pre-production overview. We've got the character sheets here that demonstrate how the character is going to be posed and sort of the scaling for the character. You can see they're in something called an A pose, which is how you traditionally pose characters in sketches, as well as their preliminary resting model when you actually make them in 3D space. And then to the right, we have something a little more abstract called the mood board. So the mood board basically just lets you collect various pieces of inspiration and referential material that you feel connect to your short. They can be very, you know, different from one another, but they all have a very sort of, you know, abstract creative element that ties back into the story you want to tell. And this is a really useful process for helping you as a creator sort of pull the vision out of your own head and grounding it in things that are tangible and can be referenced by other people. So mood boards are a huge help in starting the creative process.
So normally after you do those steps of pre-production, you make what's called an animatic. As Wyatt mentioned, this is basically just taking your storyboards and then putting them in a movie format to get the timing and kind of the feeling of your short. Since we are running a little bit shorter on time, I am going to skip the animatic, but it's okay because we're going to see the final product at the end anyway. So as we said before, after you leave the process of pre-production, you step into the world of modeling. So for this part, I'm going to hand it over to Abby.
Yes. Okay. So as we can see, everything in this scene has already been modeled, but we're going to inspect some of these objects and kind of look into the process of how it's been done. So if Ashna just clicks on one of these cardboard boxes here, we can see that this started out as just a basic cube, and it's been turned into a little bit more. So something nice that Maya has is these already pre-made basic geometric elements. So the modeler here definitely just started out with a cube and added these things called edge loops, which Ashna is clicking right now. And as you can see, you can manipulate these edge loops. You can scale them, you can move them, you can rotate them in various ways. And so these edge loops really help define the shape of our objects based on where they're really strategically placed. As you can see, you can also manipulate faces, you can manipulate vertices as well. Yeah, as Ashna is showing, you can do a lot with basic shapes and all of these different elements. So if Ashna moves over to the couch, we can see this is another example of hard surface modeling, but these shapes are a bit softer, especially for the cushions. So right here, you can kind of tell that the edge loops are a bit more spaced out, and that was definitely intentional because we have these two different modes you can switch between. Right now it's in smooth mode, but you can also go to hard mode, and basically when it's smooth, the edges are basically like interpolated between, and we can get this nice smooth surface. So yeah, that's a bit of the props. And now let's take a look at character modeling, which is a bit more involved. So as you can see, he has a lot more faces and a lot more edges. This is because this was definitely made in a 3D sculpting software and then transported to Maya. But this is done for a reason, because when we model characters, we really have to think about how the topology is what we call where the edges are placed, how that is going to affect production later on, because every little thing, every little edge affects how rigging will happen, how animation will happen. So that's why we have to be so intricate and specific about modeling for characters. And yeah, we look at his clothing too. The same thing happens. This shirt doesn't look super rigid. It looks more organic as a result, but that's definitely a little bit more costly because we have a lot more polygons. But yeah, that is the general gist of modeling.
So next up is shading, and in our class we teach a certain renderer called Pixar Renderman, which is developed by Pixar. It's freely available for students, which is why we teach it in this class, and it's also like an industry standard. So to take a look at our shader, the material that's defining this object, we're going to go click on it and open the attribute editor. And yeah, you can go see the material attributes right now in this node, which is called a Pixar surface. So this kind of just defines how the object is supposed to look in the render. And right now it's this, I guess, kind of glossy clay painted pot kind of thing, but we can play around with that. So if we go to the attributes, we can go and change the color, for example, to something else. Yeah, so she set it to this pink color. Because of the specific lighting in this scene where everything's kind of blue and dim, it's not super noticeable, but the color has definitely just changed. There's other attributes that we can play around with, like the specularity of the object. So changing the face color will allow us to define how bright the highlights are that get reflected from the object. And then changing the roughness will let us change how matte or diffuse the highlights are on the object. So the rougher or the higher the roughness value, the more matte the object will get, and vice versa when we turn it up. We can also do stuff like making the object into a glass object, and yeah, by going down to the glass attributes and turning up the refraction gain and the reflection gain. So basically, through all of these different attributes, of which there are many, you can go and define pretty much any type of surface that you want.
Great. So with that, I think we're going to move over to rigging. So first thing that you can see here is all these kind of curves in 3D space that are surrounding our character Alfredo here. And what these are called are controllers, and we use them to move the different parts of our character around. And as we learned earlier, this makes it a lot easier for animators to move around the character later on in the process. So first off, let's take a look maybe at the arm controllers. And as you can see, Ashna can rotate each joint individually, and that's kind of moving the entire arm, and she can move down the chain and affect each joint. So this is something called forward kinematics. It is just defined explicitly by how much you're rotating or moving each of these joints. On the other hand, if we look down at the feet, then that's something called inverse kinematics. So as you can see, if Ashna moves around the feet, then the knee kind of follows that movement. So it looks like a natural way to pick up the foot, even though we're not really defining the bend of the knee directly. So that's known as an inverse relationship because we're just moving that bottom joint and it's affecting the joints above it in the chain. We can also move something called a locator that's going to impact how the knee is pointed during that process. All right, and then one last thing, we have some controllers for the mustache of Alfredo and eyebrows. Yeah. Sorry, mustache is on a different character. But for the eyebrows, yeah, so we have controllers down lower there that control the fine movements of the eyebrows. We also use something called blend shapes to affect different expressions on the face. So these are all aspects of rigging. And if Ashna also shows us the skeleton, then we can see that we have something of like a bone system inside our character. And really what that's doing is we're connecting that to the mesh itself. And the mesh follows where all of these bone joints move. And then the controllers actually move the bones themselves. So the skeleton kind of acts as that intermediate stage in the movement.
All right. So now that we have a rig for this character, an idea for a rig for this character, we would move on to the step of animation. And normally I would walk through my entire process of how to do it, but since we're a little low on time, I'm just gonna kind of show you some animation that I already had on this character. So one thing that he does in the short, which we'll show at the end, is that he basically pulls a light switch, which you can see right there. So basically the main part that I animated for that was his arm, as you'd expect. And I started with the top arm, as Ethan mentioned. That's like if you're an FK, you want to start with the top and go to the bottom. So I basically had his arm move backwards first to kind of anticipate the motion, then forward. You can see there's some like black clipping there. That's something that happens in animation, which if you were refining it, you would go back and fix it. But for now, we're just gonna roll with what we have. So his arm goes back, goes up, and then at this point, I also started adding some animation to his forearm or his elbow. And just to make it less rigid and have some kind of overlapping movements in his arm, because obviously it would look a little strange if it was only his shoulder moving and not everything else. So then that carries over into the wrist as well. You'll see all of these things down here are what we call keyframes. And that's basically just a way to tell Maya or like tell any program that these are the key poses that your character is hitting. So the shoulder, the elbow, and the wrist all kind of follow a similar motion path. And they all kind of go up, bend towards the light, come back down for a little bit of a rebound, and then come back to the side. So if you play that out, that's what it looks like. And when I did this, because I had some time, I added something in the fingers just to make it look a little bit more natural. I know, unfortunately, we don't have the time to actually like show the process, but animation is just one of those things that really takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of practice. So definitely when you first approach it, it might not feel so intuitive, but after practicing a bit, you know, something like this is very tangible. And in a real animation, I would add things to maybe his, you know, his chest or his back, or, you know, just so that he's not so isolated. But for now, this is what we got, and, you know, it looks pretty all right. So at this point, we walked through all the stages. We kind of breezed over lighting, but this set already does have lighting in it. Which is since it's since it's a basement, is a little bit dark. But at this point, we would go into rendering and compositing. So we are going to show you guys the final product of all of this work and show you what the final short looked like for Brilliance. All right. So with that, that concludes our demo. Thank you guys so much for watching with us. And at this point, we have about 7 minutes left in our demo. So there are some questions coming through on the chat. But if anyone has any questions now that they'd like to ask, we'd be happy to answer them. So feel free to either write them in the chat, or if you would like to unmute yourself, now would be the time. Yes, we can. To answer some of the questions that already came in the chat, for anyone else that's curious. So yes, UCBUGG is offered every semester, every fall and spring. So not summer, but every other semester. And we always recommend that you take UCBUGG during a semester where you can actually give the time, because our class is pretty involved. Even though it's a decal, it's one of the more, if not the most work intensive decals offered here. And you know, it's always up to the individual, like how much time they want to spend in the class. So if you're taking like 3 tech courses and you know you have to declare for CS or something, maybe that's not the best semester to take UCBUGG. But since we're offered every semester, you know, you can always wait to take it another time. I see some other questions. So is this the only animation class at Cal? This is one of the few ones. Unfortunately, Berkeley does not have too many animation classes, hence why our decal exists and why it's so popular is because a lot of people are really interested in animation. But there is, in addition to our decal, there is our sister decal called Art for Animation, which focuses on the like pre-production side. So all the stuff that Wyatt talked about, it's all about that. And there is a class called CNM 190, which is a year-long class taught by Dan Garcia. It is offered every other year, so the next chance is this coming fall. And that is probably, if you're really interested in animation, that is the absolute must class to take at Cal. And it's a really great opportunity to spend a lot of time to make a great short film. And the only real prerequisite for that class is actually UCBUGG. So definitely if you're interested in animation, UCBUGG and CNM are kind of the ways to go. And I see someone else ask, is this the only modeling and shading class? More or less, yeah. Besides CNM 190, there aren't really any 3D modeling and shading courses. And you know, in UCBUGG, we have to cover the whole pipeline, so we only get to spend like a week or 2 on each topic. So I really do wish there was a more like, you know, specific to modeling and shading course, but unfortunately, that doesn't exist yet at Cal.
If I could just say something, I think that if you're interested in like the technical side of things as well, then there is a CS class, CS 184, that really gives you an idea of how like the software Maya works and how rendering is done and all of that. There's also, I think, a couple courses in engineering, in the engineering department for 3D modeling for design and some other design courses. So there are a couple other options as well, but for any animation, this is definitely the way to go.
Yeah, Connie also brought up a great note that there are classes called Animation Collaborative, which are taught and hosted by Pixar animators, and they are offered right across the street from Pixar. So this is not at Berkeley, but it is a great class that a lot of facilitators have taken, and students who go through UCBUGG do get a discount. So that is a great class if you're interested in specifically animation, the animation portion of the pipeline. But yeah, like Ethan mentioned and Abby in the chat, there are a lot of other classes and or decals that are related to the skills that you learned. So whether that's modeling for engineering or modeling for games or things like that, there are definitely other options just in a slightly different context outside of animation. So yeah, hopefully that helped answer your question. We can take maybe a few more. There's like 2 minutes left at this point.
Myra also asked, when did we first get involved with UCBUGG?
Oh, well, for me personally, I'm an oldie. I've been around a long time. I got involved my freshman year as a student, And then the following year, I took the advanced curriculum. So UCBUGG does have a basic and advanced option. So you should definitely check out both if you're interested. And then the following semester, I became facilitator, and I've been facilitator for 3.5 years now. It's been a while, but other facilitators, you guys can speak to this.
I've also been a facilitator for quite a bit. I'm a senior now. I got involved with UCBUGG as a sophomore, and I did the basic and advanced curriculum back to back because CNM 190, the year-long class, was offered the next year, and that's when I became a facilitator as well. So I've been facilitating for 2 whole years now, and it's been amazing.
I guess I can go. I like a lot of the other facilitators, we kind of go the similar route where we take first basic UCBUGG. So I took that in my spring semester or freshman year. And then I took advanced UCBUGG the fall semester of my sophomore year. And I've been a facilitator since. So this would be, I think, my 3rd semester facilitating this decal. And I found UCBUGG kind of by chance, like just looking through the decal offerings. And I feel like that's how a lot of people kind of discover a lot of decals, is that they'll look through the website for decals and they'll kind of see certain classes that they might be interested in. So this is how I found UCBUGG personally. And I'm sure some other facilitators can also speak about how they have gone into UCBUGG as well.
Yeah, I am also a senior, but this is my first and last semester facilitating. I did not take UCBUGG very sequentially. I took the basic curriculum, and then I took basically a year off and pursued some other things, and then came back for advanced, and then that was last semester. And then this semester I am facilitating.
Hi, I'm Ethan. In my experience, I got involved fairly early. I took my first semester off, just did CS stuff, and then my next semester, sophomore or freshman year in the spring, I took the basic and then the decal advanced section the next semester, and now I'm a facilitator. So yeah, that's generally the path most people take. But yeah, I'm very happy it's something I got into.
Alex, before you leave, would you like to share your story, or are you headed out?
Oh, okay. I guess I can do that real fast. So I actually I also joined I joined the spring semester of my freshman year, the same time as Connie did actually, and we were in the same basic short group, and I have been here ever since. I'm going to be one of the co-head facilitators starting this fall, so I hope to see your names again.
Alex is one of the youngins that I've seen grow up over the years. So I'm very, very proud and very happy of everyone who's taking over next semester. So for all of us oldies, there's 3 of us who are graduating right here. We will not be here in the fall, but you will be left in great hands for the fall semester, and we hope to see you then. So it is now 5:03. If there are no other last questions, that was our Cal Day demo and presentation. Thank you guys for coming. This was definitely new for us, but we really appreciate it. So thank you, everyone, and we hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we hope to see you in the future in UCBUGG.